people don't realize this, but Mr. Rouse, James Rouse, who was the large, very well-known developer in the United States from Baltimore, Maryland, from about 50, 60 till his death, developed many communities all around the United States, but his first one was in Columbia, Maryland, and his wish was to minimize as much car use as possible, and that didn't occur at that period in time. That was a challenge, but they did design, and I'm going to show you 4 Podcars.
So show us.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And also, I just want to point out, I've worked with Spartan Superways. I'd like to say that. And last year, my students worked in where were we? In Santa Cruz. No, we worked with Designs in Santa Cruz, implementing the system that Buff and the guys have all been working on. And Ron and I could have shared some of those drawings that the students did of how to take one of those hanging systems, and how if you have some topography to work with, some hills to work with, you know, you can eliminate the use of the elevator and integrate it very nicely into some environments. So let's look at Columbia. So I'm going to explain a little bit about this community, because it's considered, always has been considered, one of the top 10 communities to live in the United States, often in number 3, number 4. At this point in time, even though it was created in the 1970s, it is still considered a number 1 place or number 3 place. It's always in the top to live in the entire United States. So it was developed in the 60s and 70s, and those of you from the UK would be very familiar with the New Towns movement, and maybe from other countries as well. So this was a very important movement. And in the United States, Columbia, Maryland is considered the success story of the New Towns movement. So James Rouse he was a very prolific man, had many quotes, and so, but his most important reason for design that he would constantly reiterate was to provide for the happiness of man and his family. So while all of these other pieces are what we have to do to create happiness, he would always try to remind you that that was the goal. So he very surreptitiously, I'm not going to pronounce that correctly, he on the sly purchased a tremendous amount of land between Baltimore and Washington, because the company that financially backed him gave him a certain price that he could purchase the land for per acre, and if he paid more than that, he wasn't allowed to purchase it. And so he developed quite a few things, techniques to continue to develop this land so the price would not increase as people didn't understand what was happening at the time. And this enabled him to acquire, you can see the circle in the middle where it says Columbia, in Howard County, Maryland, which is north of Baltimore, a little bit northwest of Baltimore City. He was able to acquire all this land at a relatively low cost. And so it was designed in terms of human values, and quite consciously, and people actually camped out to become the first homeowners of the community, and it was it was not to be a car suburban type of community that was being built everywhere at the time. And he also wanted to eliminate racial, religious, and class segregation, and there were many systems as part of this community that attempted to do that. There were no individual churches built. Each village had an ecumenical center where every religion could then have its own services. So I've been doing a tremendous amount of reading about this community as many of my family live there currently, and I watched it being built. So the center of the community has a people tree to represent the community, and this gives you some statistics of the community. At this time, the density. Now, it's the rolling hills. So these are rolling hills in Maryland. This is not flat land. So this is not a flat area. So there are many stream valleys, and in fact, I don't know, many of the Europeans, we're all dealing with massive flooding, massive water issues. So the historic town that is right on the edge of this community, Podcar City, Maryland, I don't know if it made it to the news here in Europe, but they had just a massive flooding event about a month ago. Literally, the town is, for us in the United States, very old, 200 plus years, and had never seen such massive destruction, literally taking out just about the whole town. So there's rolling hills and streams, which used to be adequately taken care of because the growth, was not what we have now. So now we have communities everywhere, and when we get large rain events, we're starting to see problems, but not in Columbia. And you'll see in a minute why not. So, as I said, in the most recent poll, it ranked number 8. It's always in the top 10, and it goes very high. So, just to give you a little bit of a background about Mr. Rouse and why he worked this way, he started off, and he actually, as part of his early work, he co-founded the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, where his first efforts were tried to rehabilitate the decayed row homes in Baltimore City. And then they developed something called the Baltimore Plan, and then he served on the National Housing Task Force, and he actually is, in the United States, is identified as the person to either popularize or create the term urban renewal. So his efforts in the very beginning were actually towards the center city of Baltimore, which is considered the most European of American cities. If none of you have visited Baltimore, it's a port city, very much like Antwerp, all row homes, many small parks, very walkable. But what he became known for was building malls, shopping malls. So shopping malls surrounded by lots of parking. But when he started, when he couldn't achieve his goals within the city, he kept going of wanting to create this vision. And he started with a small community called Cross Keys, which is in the city of Baltimore. If you've never been there, I highly recommend you visit it. And so then he moved on to try to get his goals. So there was a real need for residential development, just as many of you are facing here in Europe right now. But at the time, the new town movement was what popular. It wasn't popular. He tried to get it to be back into the city and densify, like we just saw from the last presentation. But that was not going to be successful at that time. And so he really wanted to create a community. So he grew up in a very small town on the eastern shore of Maryland, which is flatlands, waterways, and he wanted people to have a small town feel, and so there would be villages. So I'll show you in a second. So he wanted people to experience new foods, tactile, aesthetic, and social relations. I mean, he really carefully designed this about people. And you have to realize Baltimore is a very old port city, so the idea of a lot of international culture is a part of the city. So he called it a garden for the growing of people. And I show you this diagram because you get a sense of the open space. So you have to imagine this is 1970. Everybody's building suburbia. And this is what Mr. Rouse wants to build. So all the black areas will be open. It was very much founded with a good deal of industrial. Jobs were very much important to be within the community, around the community. And there was to be a town center. And then, as you can see, the residential. So he wanted it to be complete and self-sustaining. Respect the land. I mean, nowadays, this is what we're all saying, but this is what he did in 1970. And for the growth of people, but notice, always one of his goals was to make a profit. And he did make a profit over his lifetime. So the forgotten part of this history and of this place where everyone loves to live in Maryland is the fact that a PRT system was part of the very early design process of this city, or this community. And I'll show you the few drawings I could find. And it was designed with greenways. You'll see this in a minute. That connected everything. So it was designed so that you could safely walk and bike between the villages, and that children could easily walk and bike to schools. And so there's a whole network of paths that do not intersect with roads in any way. And then the way the roads are laid out keeps the amount of automobile use in very specific locations. But not only that, it's incredibly green. So if you want to find a gas station, it's there, but it's very hard to find to this day. So see, these are some of the early planning diagrams which were very much adhered to in terms of the layout of this new town. And the industry is on the edges, and then the different neighborhoods with the town center. And a lake was built, was created, out of the streams and the roadways at the town center. And I'm not showing you all the beautiful, pretty pictures because I thought you'd be more interested in the planning diagrams. So here are some of the drawings I have found about the PRT system, which are very interesting. So we can see this is the guideway proposal and the right-of-ways, the transit station, and what they call the feeder routes. These larger circles here are a 900-foot walking radius. It's interesting. So what I want to do next, which I haven't been able to do yet, is to go and see how much of this still remains, and whether we could now put his full vision into action, which would be amazing. It's actually a very, very wealthy community as well. It has the Johns Hopkins research labs. It has many of the research labs for many of our government agencies surround the community. Okay, just about done here. And so what actually wound up happening was a dollar bus was placed on the dedicated roadway paths. And what I think is most interesting is you noticed how PRT is tucked into the landscape. And so it's elevated, it's a raised system, but it doesn't function connected to the land as a raised system. And you can see how people can then go under and around. And they actually design the stations. I brought one of the books with me that had all the costing for it. And I thought it was amazing that it was going to only cost $315 per resident once the community was created. These were all the systems that were available at that time as potential systems to be implemented in this community. And the person who did this study was from the Catholic University of America, and they analyzed dual mode, personal rapid dial-a-bus, and what happened then became this dial-a-bus system. They didn't win the money. Morgantown, West Virginia won the research money to put in the PRT system, and I think Mr. Rouse, being the good businessman that he was, had wanted the research money. So, thank you, and maybe something new for us.